It is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. Lamentations, chapter 3, verse 22 and 23. I've read this verse many times, but this week one phrase wouldn't leave me alone. New every morning. Every morning. And it made me wonder, if God's mercies are new every morning, maybe his invitation is too. Hey guys, welcome back to You Can't Sit With Us. I was thinking this week about something we've talked about over and over again on this podcast. We've talked about fear. We've talked about guilt. We've talked about self-condemnation. We've talked about other people's opinions. Week after week, we've been identifying the things that don't belong at the table God prepared for us. And that's important, because before you can protect the table, you have to recognize what's stealing your peace. But this week, I found myself asking a different question. What happens after those things leave? What happens when fear gets up from the table? What happens when guilt finally loses its seat? What happens when you stop letting someone else's opinions define you? What sits there now? Because I don't think God ever intended for us to simply clear the table. I think he intended to fill it. Psalm 23:5 says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." Every time I read that verse, I notice something different. David doesn't say God prepared an empty room. He doesn't say God prepared a hiding place. He says God prepared a table. And tables are meant to be lived around. There where conversation happen. There where relationships grow. There where people gather. And maybe that's why this picture has become so meaningful to me. Because every morning, I think God prepares that table again. Not because yesterday didn't matter, but because today is another invitation. Another opportunity to sit with him. Yesterday's fear doesn't have to become today's breakfast. Yesterday's shame doesn't have to be served again. Yesterday's disappointment doesn't have to become today's conversation. Yesterday's failures, they don't have to get another seat. Every morning, God prepares something new. And that's one of the most beautiful things about following him. His mercy isn't left over from yesterday. His grace isn't running low. His invitation never expires. Every single morning, he says, "Come, sit with me." Not after your circumstance improve. Not after you figure everything out. Not after the anxiety disappears. Today, in the middle of it all. Because Psalm 23 doesn't say God prepares a table after the enemies leave. It says he prepares it in the presence of our enemies. I've thought about that a lot because I spend so much of my life waiting for peace. Waiting until life settles down. Waiting until the relationship gets better. Waiting until the anxiety goes away. Waiting until I stop feeling overwhelmed. But maybe peace was never waiting outside for the enemies to leave. Maybe peace was already sitting at the table. Sometimes my enemies aren't people. Sometimes they're fear, insecurity. Sometimes they're yesterday's mistakes. Sometimes they're shame, disappointment. Sometimes they're uncertainty. And yet God still prepares the table. He still invites me to sit. He still offers peace in the middle of everything that's trying to steal it. You know, I think a lot of us spend years trying to get rid of the wrong things. I just want to stop worrying. I just want to stop feeling guilty. I just want to stop overthinking. But here's what I've learned. If all we do is remove something, we'll eventually find ourselves reaching for it again. Because our hearts don't stay empty for long. Jesus tells this fascinating story in Matthew 12. He describes an unclean spirit leaving a house. Then he says the house is swept, put in order. Everything looks clean. Everything looks better. But then he says something surprising. The house is empty. And because it's empty, the spirit comes back and brings others with it. For a long time, I thought that passage was only about spiritual warfare. But I think there's a principle there that applies to our everyday lives. An empty heart is vulnerable. An empty chair doesn't stay empty forever. Something always fills it. If comparison leaves, what takes its place? If fear leaves, who sits down next? If guilt walks away, what occupies that space? Because if we don't intentionally invite truth to sit there, the lies eventually wander back in. Maybe that's why Paul writes in Philippians 4 to think about whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable. He doesn't just say, stop thinking about bad things. He tells us what to replace them with. I wonder how often we pray, God, take away my anxiety. But we never intentionally invite his peace to stay. Or we ask him to remove our shame, but we struggle to accept his grace. Maybe the empty chair is waiting for grace. Maybe the empty chair is waiting for truth. Maybe the empty chair is waiting for gratitude. Or maybe it's waiting for the voice of God because we've allowed every other voice to speak first. Every week we've talked about someone or something that couldn't sit with us. Fear, guilt, comparison, self-condemnation, other people's opinions. But maybe the real invitation was never about who was leaving. Maybe it has always been about who was waiting for us. I realized something over the past several weeks. This podcast has never really been about telling people what can't sit with us. It's about learning who already has a place at God's table. The more we've walked through these conversations together, the more I've realized the table was never just an illustration. It becomes the place where God keeps teaching me. Every week I sit down thinking we're going to talk about fear or guilt or comparison or other people's opinions. And somehow every time, God brings me back to the same place, the table. Because following Jesus isn't just about avoiding the wrong things. It's about learning to recognize his voice. It's about learning what belongs in our hearts, what shapes our minds, what influences our decisions, and what keeps drawing us closer to him. Maybe that's why I can't seem to leave this table. Because every time I sit down with him, he teaches me something new. Some mornings he reminds me to trust. Some mornings he reminds me to rest. Some mornings he asks me to forgive. And some mornings he simply reminds me to stay. And I've realized the table isn't where the conversation ends. It's where it begins. So here's the question I want to leave you with this week. Look around your table. Not at who's leaving, at who's staying. When fear gets up, who sits down? When guilt walks away, who fills the chair? When comparison leaves the room, does gratitude finally have a place? When control lets go, does trust finally move in? The beautiful thing about God's table isn't that he removes every enemy. It's that his presence is greater than every one of them. The table has never been about perfection. It's always been about presence. So maybe that's the invitation today. Don't just ask God to clear the table. Ask him to fill it. Fill it with peace and wisdom. Fill it with grace. Fill it with truth and joy. Fill it with his presence. Because empty chairs don't stay empty. So let's make sure we're inviting the right guests. Around this table, mercy has a seat every single morning. Peace has a seat. Grace and truth have a seat. And Jesus is still at the head of the table. Everything else, you can't sit with us. I'll see you next week.